Hello and welcome to you, the Diligent Scholar. You're watching this introductory VOD because perhaps you are considering taking AP Comparative Government. This is a comprehensive course. On its own, sometimes the subject matter can be rather daunting. There's many different countries that are studied, and within these countries that are studied, there's many different forces that are gone over as well. What we do here at Stephen Academy on the Video Demand course for AP Comparative Government is break things down so you can understand the matter, understand the course, and of course get a 5 on the exam. We discuss everything in this class, from the advanced democracies such as Great Britain and the European Union, to developing countries such as Mexico to Nigeria, to the post-communist countries and even present communist countries, which is to say Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. In a word, Diligent Scholar, everything, and I do mean everything, you need to know is covered in this video on demand lesson. Before you take this lesson though, you'll need 2 texts, and they do come with the lesson. The first is the 6th edition of AP Comparative Government by Ethel Wood. This text complements the class, and you will be reading it as we go over the video lessons together. The second, just as important, indeed if not more important, is the AP Comparative Government Workbook, designed by yours truly, and my name, Michael Ricotta. In this workbook, you will not only find multiple choice questions that painstakingly have been researched to mimic those on the exam itself, but the all-important key terms. These key terms break down very disparate, very different subject matter into small bite-sized chunks so you can understand the material, incorporate the material, and nail the 5 on the upcoming exam. So, if you do want a 5 on the exam for AP Comparative Government, if you want to have a thorough understanding of AP Comparative Government and improve your writing style in general on the AP level, I encourage you to take this class. It provides you, the Diligent Scholar, with everything you need to know. So, I hope to see you soon in lesson number 1 of Stephen Academy's Video On Demand lessons for Advanced Placement Comparative Government. Hello and welcome to lesson number 1 of Stephen Academy's AP Comparative Government Study course, video on demand lessons just for you, the Diligent Scholar. Of all the AP courses, perhaps really none is as comprehensive as AP Government. In AP Government Comparative, we study a little bit of geography, a little bit of economy, some key terms, some demography, that is the study of peoples. Everything is included in this course, and this course is designed specifically to give you all the information you need to get a 5 on the test. So we're going to be covering a lot of material. You'll notice as well, Diligent Scholar, that this course is a little front-heavy. What do I mean when I say that? I mean, the first section, the key terms section, is the most critical section, and we're going to be spending more time than any other section on the first section. This is the key terms, the definitions that are really part and parcel of the entire course. Now, when we're done with this section, we're going to move on and study individual nations and supranational organizations, such as Great Britain, the European Union, the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, the Federal Republic of Nigeria, the United States of Mexico. All of these states are states we're going to study, not forgetting the Islamic Republic of Iran, each of them with their own differences and their own exceptions. But for each country, we're including all of the key terms we're learning right now. So in a way, we're going to get a template in the next few lessons that we'll be applying to each country separately. So this is really the meat of the matter, as they say, at the very beginning. Hope you're ready. I'm sure you are. So there we are, and I'm getting ahead of myself. This beautiful weather here in Seoul is getting to my head. My name is Michael Ricotta. You may remember me from such VODs as SAT2 World History, SAT2 United States History, and Advanced Placement United States Government and Politics. If you're a returning student, I gladly welcome you aboard. If you're a new student, I cordially greet you. So, let's go ahead and, if you would, take out a pen and a piece of paper, and we'll begin with our notes, and we'll go ahead and dive into the course. So, let's go ahead and begin by talking about government. What is it? Well, Diligent Scholar, government is related to politics, which will be our second definition. Once again, I cannot overemphasize the importance of these first lessons. You're going to get a whole slew of terms. These terms are absolutely vital for understanding each of the nations we're going to study specifically. So once again, this is the template that we're going to be imposing on these various different countries. This, in a way, is the tool we're going to use to compare the different subjects. So pay attention, grab some espresso if you need to. Government, diligent scholar, is simply the collective name for those institutions which create what we call public policy. That is what goes on in a country on an official level. There's three types of public policy. It may either be promotional, it may be regulatory, or it may be distributive. Now, what do I mean when I say that? Promotional is the aspect of governmental public policy in which a government promotes something. Civil rights, political rights, the right of certain groups to vote, the need for a war perhaps, right? All of those are promotional. Regulatory is another important aspect of government. The government generally, by nature, regulates society. What can you do? What can't you do? And when can you do it? And distributive. Government gives things out. It gives things out in many cases like welfare. That's an important concept we're going to be learning about in here. That is Social Security or health programs, pension programs, child welfare programs, various different kinds of programs. So promotional, government promotes things. Regulatory, government regulates things. And distributive, government gives things out. Of course, it doesn't give them out for free. People pay taxes that provide for it. Politics, we're going to give a more concise definition, is who gets what, when, where, and why. That is the process of politics. Who gets what, when do they get it, where do they get it, and lastly, put the question mark there, slip of the pen, why do they get it? So this is really the bedrock of our course. And from here, we're going to be expanding out. Public government is the institutions which create public policy, presidents, legislatures. Politics, who gets what, when, where, and why. So these are the basic definitions. But before I go any further, even take it up a notch even a little, I want to talk about two sectors. That's really, these are global definitions, because every country in the world, every civilization that has ever existed is either in one of these two sectors, or rather, let me take a step back, operates in both of these sectors. We have the private sector and the public sector. The public sector are all those aspects of society which are run by the government. Examples of the public sector are many and varied. So you'd have things like postal services, militaries, of course the institutions of government, anything that affects the public as a whole. That's why we call it the public sector, collective society. Now, of course, you may well guess, if this is all institutions that are run by the government, everything from your dog catcher to the president, or the supreme leader in the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the private sector then are all those aspects of society which are run by private citizens or individuals. So, when I say public sector and private sector, I'm not talking about the sectors of the economy. We're going to get to those in a little bit. I'm just talking about the general outlay of society. What is run by society and what is run privately by individuals. Now, this is a dynamic which moves back and forth. Some countries certainly have a larger public sector, and some countries certainly have a larger private sector. But we'll be getting to that in a moment. So those are the basic definitions. So if these are the basic definitions, then we need to move into the sphere of comparisons. There's two ways generally in this course we're going to compare governments. This is comparative government. So you may well ask, how do we compare? And what are we comparing? Of course, governments. There are two approaches, diligent scholar. The first approach to comparing different governments, to comparing different countries, indeed really to comparing different civilizations, is what we call the empirical approach. And it's interesting, I always discuss with my students here just what a wide-ranging class this is. So we've talked already about a little bit of economy, a little bit about economics. We've talked a little bit about government. Now we're reaching into the philosophical realm. Empiricism and empirical knowledge, the empirical approach is based on what you can quantify and verify. So we'll say here, this is based on statistics, based on data, generally based on factual information. And when I say factual information, I'm speaking about information that is objective. So, this is a class designed for students in the United States at the senior level of high school, of secondary education. So I'm hoping by now you know what objective means. But just in case you don't, an example of an objective statement would be, this is a podium. This is a marker. Now, can you disagree with me that this is a marker? No, obviously, clearly, this is a marker based on factual information, right? This is a marker. That's objective. It's a statement of fact. You can't disagree with it. Now, the other way we are able to compare governments in here is the opposite, and that would be called the normative approach. The normative approach is based on issues that require value judgments. And here we're speaking about things good and bad, right and wrong. So to go back to our earlier example here, this is a pen. That's an objective statement. Is this a pretty pen? I don't know. I think it's pretty good looking. You might say, no, that's an ugly pen. That is subjective. You have made a value judgment. Now, as you might well imagine, this class, we're going to try to focus on the empirical data. Normative data really isn't that supportable. What I think is good may be different than what, for example, an Iranian thinks is good. What I think is a good level of religious involvement in society by the government may be very different from what the Ayatollahs of Iran believe. So we're going to try to stick to this. We're going to stick to statistics, data, and factual information. I would concentrate on that. I really do not think we should be using too many normative statements in this class. And as we go through examples of various free response questions as the class waxes on, I'm going to give you examples of my empirical answers, and I want you to concentrate on that as well. So, these are the two approaches. If these are the approaches, diligent scholar, then what are the tools? Well, what we can say is there's several ways or first of all, the goal of this class is to compare one country to another. There it is. To do this, we're going to use several items. So the first we're going to use is generally, our approach is going to be similar to the scientific method. You can see here we're going to be very clinical. We're going to go down the road of empiricism. And of course, those of you, and I hope you have, who've taken a science course before, know what a hypothesis is, which is going to be the first way we compare one country to another, or the first element, I should say, involved in our comparison. This is a speculative statement. about one or more variables. So an hypothesis might be, if the country has a large military, it will be more likely to go to war, right? That's a speculative statement. I'm not sure if it's true or not. Now, variables will be our second element. Variables are measurable traits or characteristics Moreover, these are measurable traits or characteristics that change in different conditions. An example of variables might be birth rates, specifically variables for comparative government. We're going to be sticking to that. We're not going to get too large screen here. So it could be a birth rate, literacy rate, so on and so forth. All of these things are measurable traits. How many people are born in a country? How many people die in a country? What is the voting rate in a country? What is the poverty level of a country? So those are variables. Our next element will be causation, which is the idea that one variable influences another. That is causation. Now, to understand causation, we need to break down variables. There's really two different types. We have independent variables and dependent variables. The reason we call these independent variables is because they depend on dependent variables. I told you, this is a very clinical class, very definitive. So let's go ahead and talk about what a dependent variable is. Its actions depend on an independent variable. So let me go ahead and give you an example. An example of this illustrated would be literacy rate. That is, how many people in a country can read, right? The literacy rate depends on this, how many schools a country has. Right? How many people in a country can read directly depends on how many schools a country has. If there's more schools, more people will be able to read. If there's fewer schools, less people will be able to read. If the country spends more money on education, obviously more people will be able to read. So here we see the reaction or the relationship between a dependent variable and an independent variable. Another example might be the number of transportation networks a country has, or let's say the number of railroads a country has, depends on how many taxpayers a country has. So a country that's wealthier, that has more people paying taxes in the first place, will have a better rail system, or a better air traffic system, or even a better road network. The road network depends on how many taxpayers there are. That's the difference between a dependent and an independent variable. Now, of all these elements, the last is correlation. Correlation is, or we could say rather, correlation exists when a change in one variable coincides with a change in another. So going back to our example just a moment ago regarding dependent and independent variables, regarding the dependent variable literacy rate and the independent variable how many schools a country has, is there a correlation? Indeed there is. The more schools a country has, the higher the literacy rate will be. the fewer schools a country has, the lower the literacy rate will be. So we can say there is correlation in that circumstance. Now, those are the fundamental bedrock definitions. Those are the items we can use to compare and contrast different elements of countries and societies. How do we generally compare countries on the macro or the larger level? Well, there's several different approaches. So let's talk about now comparing countries. Comparing countries. The first method, and the method that it was used up until fairly recently, I'd say about 10 or 15 years ago, is what we call the three worlds approach. This was used during the Cold War. The Cold War really, more than any other, I think, single conflict influenced the 20th century. It was an ideological conflict between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics that we're going to talk about really in detail when we get to the Soviet Union, or, excuse me, the Russian Federation, which is what it's called now. But this really is kind of passé nowadays, but we'll go ahead and describe it because these are terms I'm almost certain you've heard. If there's three worlds, then we divide it, of course, into three. The first world. In the three-world system, these are the advanced democracies. More specifically, these are the democracies that were allied to the United States during the Cold War. So we can say it's also the United States and its allies. So in the three worlds model, this included most countries in Western Europe, North America, and East Asia. For example, Japan and the Republic of Korea. Republic of Korea, not the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The second world, if the first world was the United States and its allies, the second world then would be those countries associated with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So these would be the countries allied with what Russia was then called. They were largely located in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The Stan states, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, these countries on the whole had a lower standard of living than first world countries, on the whole. So these are the second world countries, and here's the word that gets bandied about a lot nowadays, the third world. The Cold War was a bipolar conflict, really. It pit the first world against the second world. It pit the United States and its allies against the Soviet Union and its allies. And all states not involved with this bipolar conflict were lumped together in the third world. These were countries that belonged to neither. So you can see here, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Japan and Korea, North America have all been covered. So where were the majority of third world countries? Well, they could be said to have been in South America and Africa. And it's really almost become like a derogatory term. Oh, that country, country X, is just a third world country. Not that it's not allied to one of these two states, the first world or the second world, but it's really just kind of a lowly developed, not a really nice place, probably somewhere you wouldn't want to go. So we're moving away from this model, the three worlds approach, which brings us to our second approach of comparing countries. That is, those countries which are democracies, and those countries which can be said to be authoritarian. And in this system, really, as I said just a moment ago, which countries have democratic governments and which countries have authoritarian governments. This is used, for example, we could say the United States is a democracy, and for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran is an authoritarian state. But this model isn't too accurate either, because it goes back and forth. It's fluid. Some countries are more democratic, some countries are more authoritarian, but even those countries which are somewhat authoritarian might have democratic tendencies. So we're not going to use this model too much either. The third model of comparing countries is an economic model, and it focuses on those countries which practice capitalism versus those countries that practice communism. Properly put, it would be those countries with free or mixed market economies and those countries with command economies, for those of you who have taken economics before. This really isn't that useful either nowadays, because there are very few command economies left in the world, largely because the command model of economics really isn't that successful, and ultimately they end up collapsing. Now, the method we're going to use in here, and the method that's really in vogue nowadays, is the fourth method, which is the MEDC versus LEDC, which stands for more economically developed countries and less economically developed countries. These are countries with relatively, keyword there is relative, no absolute statements, developed economies, and these are countries with relatively underdeveloped economies. So, this is the model we're going to be sticking to here. Before we continue further and talk about specifically different countries and classify them together, I want to talk about the economy, specifically the sectors of the economy, because this is going to be a recurrent thread throughout this class. For example, if I ask you in an FRQ, and I very well might, identify the primary economic center or the economic sector of the United States of Mexico. You would say Mexico is a largely secondary sector country with the vestiges rather of a primary sector. So let's talk about the economic sectors. I told you we'd be all over this place with this class. I mean, this class compares different countries, and to accurately compare different countries, you need a lot of different information, a lot of different variables. So let's go ahead and talk about the sectors of the economy. And I wonder if I dare presume that some of you students have taken economics before. Again, in America, this is what you might call a capstone class. That is, you would take it your senior year after taking all the other social sciences, so you can draw on all the information from history, from geography, from economics, and utilize it in this course. So if this is familiar, awesome. If it isn't familiar, no problem. We'll cover it now. The first, well, I should say, largely, there are three sectors to the economy. A lot of sociologists and a lot of economists argue that there's a fourth and fifth sector to the economy, the quaternary and the quinary. We're not really going to go into that, largely because this test is, or this class rather, is specifically designed for you to get a 5 on the AP test, so we don't need to go in for that information. We'll focus on the tried and true 1 through 3. And the first sector of the economy we may call the primary sector. The primary sector of the economy involves the retrieval and production of raw materials. Very basic. Indeed, the most basic. The retrieval and production of raw materials. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about agriculture, mining, fishing. of raw materials. These are not processed goods. I pick up the corn from the ground, I dig the dirt out of the mine, I grab the fish from the ocean. All of these take place on the primary level. So an example of some primary level occupations, rather occupations in the primary sector, might be a coal miner or a fisherman. I guess I can still say that is politically correct. These are all primary sector level occupations. Let's kick it up a notch. Let's go to the secondary sector. The secondary sector, lady or gentleman, involves the transformation of raw materials into goods. In a word, we call this production. So therefore, secondary sector economies would be industrial. These are industrial economies. They make things. An example here would be steel manufacturing or textile industries. Right? So an example of an occupation in the secondary sector would be a factory worker or a dressmaker. Dressmaker sounds somewhat specific. I could say in general a clothier. Someone who makes clothes. These, I don't want to say they operate from least advanced to more advanced, but you could see here there are more complicated steps. Primary sector is pretty basic. You harvest the resources of the earth. Secondary sector is a little more advanced. You transform these raw resources into a good or a finished product. The third sector could be said to be the most advanced, and we call this the tertiary sector, or the third sector. It's also called the service sector. And the service sector involves supplying services. So it provides services to consumers. Now, what is a service? In economics, sometimes these are called intangibles or invisible goods. This is something not like a raw resource that's transformed, like a piece of steel that I might sell. This is different. This involves, for example, banking, insurance, entertainment, even restaurants. So examples of tertiary level or service sector jobs might involve shopkeepers, accountants, grocers, so on and so forth. And really, we're going to be dividing the countries that we're going to study, Nigeria, so on and so forth, Mexico, Britain, into these three categories. We can say that Britain, for example, has a very large tertiary sector and a decreasing primary sector, whereas Nigeria, for example, is still dependent on its primary sector for the majority of its GDP. We'll get to that definition in a few lessons down the road. And I think we'll end our first lesson here today on the three levels of the economy. Still to come in our discussion of how we compare countries are the demographic transition model, and we're going to plug the MEDC and LEDC model, or rather we're going to take the countries we're going to study and plug it into that model. So there's been a whole lot of key terms in this lesson. Look them over. Because the first section of this class is so front heavy or top heavy, if you will, we're going to be going through quite a few VODs before you get your first homework assignment. So it would behoove you to take all the definitions you've got and turn them into flashcards for your key terms. So there we go. I will continue with you when I see you next time, and we continue on the fundamentals of AP Comparative Government. Thanks again for hopping on board.